Hey guys, tonight we begin with something ancient, quiet, and just a little bit confusing. So maybe dim the lights, get comfortable, and let your brain slowly drift into the warm desert air. No need to solve anything, no need to figure it all out. Just listen and let the story do the work. We're heading back, way back, to a time before emails, before deadlines, before anyone argued on the internet. A time when the biggest project on Earth was stacking a truly unreasonable number of stones on top of each other, carefully, patiently, for decades. Because apparently that seemed like a good idea. And at the center of it all, the pyramids of Giza. Now, if you've ever seen a picture of the pyramids, or maybe one of those overly dramatic documentaries with ominous music, you already know the basics. Big triangles, in the desert, looking very calm and very sure of themselves, like they've been waiting thousands of years for someone to ask, "Hey, how did you even do that?" And honestly, fair question, because the Great Pyramid, the one built for Pharaoh Khufu, is not just big, it is inconveniently big. It's made of around 2.3 million stone blocks, each one weighing, well, enough to make you reconsider your life choices. Some are a couple of tons, others are much heavier, and they were all placed with surprising precision, not close enough precision, but someone clearly cared a lot precision. So tonight, we're going to slowly wander through that mystery. No rush, no dramatic conclusions, just a long, gentle look at how humans, very determined humans, might have built one of the most famous structures on Earth. Let's start with the setting. Picture Egypt, around 4,500 years ago. The Nile River flowing steadily, fields green along its banks, and beyond that, endless desert. Quiet, dry. Not exactly the most welcoming construction site, but also conveniently flat, which, for a pyramid, is kind of helpful. The ancient Egyptians were not just sitting around staring at the sand. They had a highly organized society. There were farmers, workers, scribes, priests, officials, and at the very top, the pharaoh. A king, yes, but also considered a living god, which is a lot of pressure, honestly. Khufu, the pharaoh behind the Great Pyramid, ruled during what we now call the Old Kingdom. This was a time when pyramid building was, well, trending. Not casually, not as a weekend hobby, but as a full national effort. Because when you're seen as divine, your tomb can't just be average. It has to be unforgettable. And so, naturally, someone looked at a flat desert plateau and said, "We should build something enormous here." And no one else said, "Maybe let's not." Now, here's where things get interesting. For a long time, people assumed the pyramids were built by slaves because, well, of course they did. Big project, ancient world, must be slaves, right? But modern archaeology has gently corrected that idea. Turns out, the workers were likely skilled laborers, paid, fed, organized, rotating crews who came during the Nile's flood season when farming wasn't possible. So instead of planting crops, they helped build a pyramid, which is quite the career shift. There were bakeries, breweries, living quarters, even something close to a healthcare system. If you got injured moving a giant stone block, someone probably tried to help you, which is surprisingly thoughtful for a 4,500-year-old construction project. And yes, they were still moving giant stones, so helpful has its limits. Let's talk about those stones for a moment. Most of the pyramid is made from limestone. Conveniently, there was a quarry right near the site, so workers could cut blocks and move them a relatively short distance, which is still not easy, but at least they weren't dragging everything across the country. For the inner chambers, though, they used granite, harder, heavier, and sourced from Aswan, which is about 800 kilometers away, because apparently the project wasn't ambitious enough already. So now the question becomes, how do you move massive stones over long distances without trucks, without cranes, without modern tools? The answer seems to involve boats. During the Nile's flood season, the river expanded, creating channels that reached closer to the construction site. Stones could be loaded onto barges, floated downstream, and then, somehow, transported the final stretch over land. And by somehow, we mean a lot of people pulling very hard. There's actually a famous wall painting showing workers dragging a large statue on a sled, and someone in front is pouring water onto the sand, which might seem like a random detail, but it's actually quite clever. Wet sand reduces friction, so instead of the sled getting stuck or dragging unevenly, it slides more smoothly. It's not effortless, but it's less terrible, which in this context counts as a major improvement. Now we arrive at the part everyone loves to debate. How did they lift the stones up? Because building a pyramid is not just about moving blocks across the ground. At some point, you have to go up, repeatedly, with increasingly heavy materials, without dropping them, preferably. The most widely accepted idea involves ramps. Simple in concept, complicated in execution. Workers would build a ramp leading up the side of the pyramid. As the structure grew taller, the ramp would be extended. Stones would be dragged up the ramp and placed into position. Sounds reasonable, except ramps require materials. A lot of materials. And the bigger the pyramid gets, the bigger the ramp has to be. At some point, the ramp itself becomes a project almost as large as the pyramid, which feels a bit inefficient. So other theories suggest spiral ramps, or internal ramps, or a combination of different techniques used at different stages. Basically, the ancient Egyptians may have been adjusting their strategy as they went along, which is relatable. Start with a plan, realize it's not perfect, keep going anyway. Because stopping halfway through a pyramid is probably not an option. Let's pause here for a second. Imagine the daily life of a worker. You wake up early, the sun is already warm. You eat bread, maybe some onions, possibly beer, which was surprisingly common and considered a basic staple, and then you head out to work. You and your team haul stones. You coordinate movements. You follow instructions from overseers. There's a rhythm to it, routine, maybe even a strange kind of pride, because you're not just building anything, you're building something that is meant to last forever, and somehow it did. The precision of the Great Pyramid is another quiet mystery. The base is almost perfectly level. The sides are aligned closely with the cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, not roughly, but impressively close, which raises another question. How did they measure that so accurately? Without GPS, without modern instruments, just observation, geometry, careful planning, and a lot of patience. They likely used simple tools, plumb lines, sight lines, observations of the stars, the kind of methods that sound basic until you try to do them yourself and realize they require a steady hand and a very calm mind. So while the tools were simple, the skill was not. Now, every so often, someone suggests a more imaginative explanation: aliens. Because when something is old, impressive, and a little mysterious, aliens tend to get invited into the conversation. But here's the thing. We have evidence of human involvement: tools, worker settlements, records, graffiti left by crews inside the pyramid, actual names of work teams, like Friends of Khufu, which sounds less like an alien operation and more like a very dedicated construction group. So while the pyramids are incredible, they are also very human, built step by step, block by block, over years and years, not instantly, not magically, just persistently. And maybe that's part of the mystery that feels hardest to accept, not that it was impossible, but that it was possible with enough time, enough organization, and enough people working together. No shortcuts, no hidden technology, just effort, repeated millions of times, which is, in its own quiet way, kind of amazing. So as we let the desert settle back into silence for now, we'll leave the workers still moving stones, still adjusting ramps, still building something that will outlast all of them. And in the next part, we'll drift a little deeper into the inner chambers, the strange design choices, and the small details that make the Great Pyramid feel just a bit more mysterious than it should, because, of course, it does. All right, welcome back. Or maybe you never left. Either way, we're still here, in the desert, with a structure that refuses to fully explain itself. So get comfortable again. Let your thoughts slow down. No rush. The pyramids have been waiting for thousands of years. They can wait a little longer while we take our time. In part 1, we stood outside. We watched stones move, ramps rise, and workers slowly shape something massive out of limestone and patience. Now, let's quietly step inside. The Great Pyramid isn't just a solid block of stone. That would almost be too simple. Instead, it's filled with passages, chambers, and corridors that feel oddly intentional. Not chaotic, not random, but also not entirely obvious, which is where things get interesting. The original entrance sits on the north face of the pyramid, not at ground level, but slightly above it, because of course it does. You don't just walk into a pyramid, you approach it, carefully, respectfully, possibly while questioning your life choices. From there, a descending passage slopes downward into the bedrock. It's narrow, low ceiling, not exactly welcoming, more like the pyramid is gently encouraging you to reconsider. But if you continue, and people did, you eventually reach an underground chamber, roughly cut, unfinished, a bit mysterious. And here's where historians pause, because no one is entirely sure why this chamber exists. Maybe it was the original burial plan. Maybe it was abandoned mid-construction. Maybe someone just changed their mind, which honestly happens even today, except usually with kitchen renovations, not eternal monuments. So the underground chamber sits there, quiet, incomplete, like a first draft that never got edited. But the pyramid doesn't stop there. Back near the entrance, there's another path. This one goes upward, because of course there's a hidden upward passage. It wouldn't be ancient architecture without at least one surprise hallway. This ascending passage leads into what's known as the Grand Gallery. And yes, it's exactly as dramatic as it sounds. The Grand Gallery is tall, steep, narrow, but also strangely elegant. The walls rise inward as they go up, creating a kind of corbelled ceiling. It feels engineered, thoughtful, not just functional, but intentional, almost like someone wanted it to impress. Which is interesting, because very few people were ever meant to see it. So who was it for? Good question. Maybe for the pharaoh, maybe for the afterlife, maybe for the builders themselves, a quiet way of saying, we can do this. Or maybe it was just practical, a space to move large stone blocks upward into position, functional but accidentally beautiful. Because sometimes engineering does that. At the top of the Grand Gallery, things branch out again. One path leads to the so-called Queen's Chamber, which, despite the name, probably had nothing to do with a queen, because naming things in archaeology is occasionally optimistic. The chamber is smaller, simpler. It has a pointed roof and two narrow shafts that extend outward but don't quite reach the surface, which feels unfinished or symbolic or both. No clear burial evidence was found here, so again we're left with possibilities. Was it meant for a statue? A spiritual space? A backup plan? No one seems entirely sure, and the pyramid, as usual, is not offering answers. Then there's the main event, the king's chamber. This is the room most people imagine when they think of the inside of the Great Pyramid. Rectangular, built entirely of granite, which, as we mentioned earlier, had to be transported from far away because local limestone apparently wasn't impressive enough for this part. In the center sits a large stone sarcophagus, empty, which is slightly anticlimactic. You go through all that effort, all those passages, all that stone, and when you finally arrive, there's no mummy, no treasure, no grand reveal, just a quiet, empty box, and a lot of questions. Now, before we assume something mysterious happened, like secret removals or hidden doors, it's worth remembering that tomb robbing was very common in ancient Egypt. If there was something valuable inside, chances are someone found it long before modern archaeologists arrived. So the emptiness might not be mysterious, it might just be practical human behavior, which honestly is less exciting but more consistent. Still, the design of the king's chamber is fascinating. Above it are several small chambers stacked on top of each other. These are called relieving chambers. Their job is to distribute the massive weight of the stone above so the ceiling doesn't collapse, which is thoughtful, because nothing ruins a royal afterlife like structural failure. The topmost chamber has a pointed roof made of large granite beams. Again, carefully placed, carefully measured. This isn't guesswork. This is engineering, ancient but very deliberate. And then there are the shafts. Ah yes, the famous shafts. Two narrow channels extend from the king's chamber outward, one facing north, one facing south. They're not large enough for a person, not meant for ventilation, at least not primarily. So what are they for? Some researchers believe they align with certain stars, possibly connected to the pharaoh's journey into the afterlife, a kind of symbolic pathway leading from Earth to stars, which is quietly poetic, not flashy, not dramatic, just a simple idea, from Earth to stars. Of course, not everyone agrees on that interpretation, because with something this old and this complex, there's always room for debate. And debate tends to multiply over time, kind of like theories about the pyramids. Now, let's take a slow step back. Imagine being inside the pyramid during its construction. Dim light, echoing footsteps, the sound of stone being moved, carefully, repeatedly. Workers navigating tight spaces, coordinating movements without modern communication. No radios, no phones, just voices, signals, experience. And somehow it worked. The passages align, the chambers hold, the structure remains stable. Not perfect, but impressively close. And here's something quietly interesting. There are no elaborate carvings inside the Great Pyramid. No colorful hieroglyphics covering the walls, no grand storytelling panels. Just stone, smooth, clean, minimal, which feels intentional. Later pyramids and tombs were full of decoration, texts, spells, instructions for the afterlife. But Khufu's pyramid, it's almost reserved, as if the scale of the structure was meant to speak for itself. No need for extra details. Which, honestly, is a bold design choice. Now, let's address something people often wonder. Hidden chambers, secret rooms, unexplored spaces. because with a structure this large, it's hard not to imagine there's something still waiting to be found. And in recent years, scientists have used modern technology, like muon scanning, to look inside the pyramid without digging or damaging it. And yes, they did find anomalies, large voids, empty spaces that don't match the known layout, which sounds exciting, and it is, a little, but it's also unclear. Because finding an empty space doesn't automatically tell you what it is. It could be structural. It could be leftover space from construction. It could be something more interesting. Or it could just be empty, which is slightly less thrilling, but very possible. So the mystery continues, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in a quiet, persistent way, like the pyramid itself. At this point, you might notice something. The more we learn about the pyramids, the more human they seem. Not less mysterious, just differently mysterious. Instead of asking who built this, we ask how did they organize this? Instead of what secret technology was used, we ask how did they coordinate thousands of workers over decades? And those questions are just as interesting, maybe even more so, because it reminds us that large, complex achievements don't always come from sudden breakthroughs. Sometimes they come from steady effort, careful planning, small improvements repeated over time, which is not dramatic, but it is effective. So, as we gently step back out into the desert, leaving the chambers behind, we can let the structure return to its quiet state. No voices, no movement, just stone, holding its shape under the same sky. And in the next part, we'll drift into the people behind the project, the planners, the organizers, the pharaoh himself, and the very human systems that made something like this even possible. Because behind every massive structure, there's usually a very organized group of people trying their best to keep things from falling apart, and occasionally succeeding. All right, welcome back again. Or maybe you just let the last part roll into this one. That works too. So, settle in, adjust your pillow, let your shoulders drop a little. We've walked around the pyramid, we've stepped inside, we've wandered through quiet chambers and slightly confusing hallways. Now, let's drift toward the people. Because as impressive as the Great Pyramid is, it didn't just appear one morning like a very ambitious sandcastle. It was built by humans, a lot of them. Organized, coordinated, slightly sunburned humans doing the same difficult tasks over and over again for years, which is, honestly, where the real story lives. Let's start at the top. Khufu, the pharaoh, the man whose name is forever attached to this enormous structure. Now, when people imagine ancient rulers, they often picture someone dramatic, loud, maybe giving speeches from a balcony, possibly pointing at things and saying, "Build that." Khufu is a bit quieter in the historical record. We don't have long personal diaries, no detailed interviews, no social media posts explaining his daily routine, which is probably for the best. What we do have are a few statues, some inscriptions, and a reputation that varies depending on who you ask. Some later sources describe him as harsh, even cruel, the kind of ruler who demanded a lot and didn't ask politely. Other evidence suggests something more ordinary, a king managing a large state, overseeing projects, keeping things running. So, like many historical figures, he's a bit unclear. But one thing is certain. He had a vision, or at least he approved one, and once that decision was made, there was no going back. Because building a pyramid is not a small commitment. You don't just start and then casually stop halfway through. Well, we got this far, good enough. No, you finish it. Now, Khufu didn't personally move stones. That would have been inefficient. Instead, there was a whole system beneath him: administrators, overseers, scribes, people whose job was to plan, record, and manage. And this is where things get quietly impressive, because organizing a project like this requires more than strength. It requires structure. Let's imagine the planning process. Someone had to decide where the pyramid would go. Someone had to measure the base. Someone had to calculate angles. Someone had to coordinate the delivery of materials. And someone had to keep track of it all. Enter the scribes. Scribes were basically the record keepers of ancient Egypt. They wrote things down, carefully, repeatedly, on papyrus, on stone, on anything that would hold ink. They tracked supplies, workers, schedules. If a shipment of limestone arrived late, someone probably made a note. If a crew finished their section early, someone recorded that too. It wasn't glamorous, but it was essential, because without records, things get messy, and a messy pyramid project is not something anyone wants to deal with. There's actually a fascinating discovery called the Diary of Merer. Merer was an inspector, kind of a middle manager of his time, and he kept a log of his daily activities. Not dramatic, not poetic, just practical. He recorded transporting limestone blocks by boat along the Nile, day by day, trip by trip. It's one of the oldest known written records of a construction project, and it's surprisingly calm. No complaints, no dramatic moments, just moved stone from here to there, which, in a way, makes it more real. Now, let's move down the chain. The workers. As we mentioned earlier, these weren't slaves in the traditional sense. They were laborers, organized into teams, often given names. And the names are kind of great. Things like Friends of Khufu or Drunkards of Menkaure, which suggests that even in ancient times, people enjoyed a bit of humor in their work environment. Each team had a role. Some cut stone, some transported it, some shaped it, some placed it. It was like a massive assembly line spread across a desert. And then there were the support workers, because you can't have thousands of people working all day without feeding them. There were bakers, brewers, cooks. Bread and beer were the main staples, simple, reliable, slightly repetitive, which, again, relatable. There were also medical workers. If someone got injured, and they did, there were people who knew basic treatments, setting bones, cleaning wounds, not modern medicine, but not nothing either. And then there was the rhythm of the work. Imagine the sound. Feet on sand, voices calling out instructions, ropes tightening, stone scraping slowly forward. It's not loud in a chaotic way, more like a steady repeating pattern. Pull, pause, adjust, pull again. Over and over, day after day. And here's something worth noticing. This wasn't rushed. The Great Pyramid likely took around 20 years to build, which sounds like a long time until you consider the scale. 2.3 million blocks. That's roughly one block placed every few minutes, continuously for 2 decades. No long breaks, no major delays, just steady progress, which is honestly kind of impressive and slightly exhausting to think about. Now, let's float over to another detail: living conditions. The workers didn't live randomly scattered across the desert. There were organized settlements. Archaeologists have found remains of what look like worker villages near the Giza Plateau. Simple houses, storage areas, communal spaces, not luxurious, but structured, which again points to planning. This wasn't chaos, it was a system. And systems require leadership, not just at the top, but at every level. Foremen, team leaders, inspectors, people making sure tasks were completed correctly and on time, and probably occasionally reminding others to keep pulling the rope. Now, here's a quiet thought. Not everyone working on the pyramid believed in it the same way. Some may have seen it as a religious duty, helping the pharaoh reach the afterlife. Others may have seen it as a job, work to be done, food to be earned. and some probably just showed up because that's where they were assigned, which is very human. But regardless of motivation, they all contributed, each stone placed by someone, each movement part of a larger pattern, and over time, that pattern became a structure, a very large, very precise, very persistent structure. Now, let's return to Khufu for a moment, because at the center of all this effort was one idea: immortality. The pyramid wasn't just a tomb, it was a statement, a way of saying, this matters, this will last, this will carry me beyond this life. And in a way, it worked, because we're still talking about him, still saying his name, still wondering about the thing he left behind. And maybe that's the quiet irony. All that effort, all that planning, all that stone, not just to build something big, but to build something remembered. So as the sun slowly sets over the desert and the workers finish another day, we can step back again, let the noise fade, let the structure stand on its own. And in the next part, we'll gently explore the afterlife beliefs that shaped the pyramid's purpose, the rituals, the ideas, and the quiet hope that something beyond this world was waiting. Because for the ancient Egyptians, this wasn't the end. It was just a transition. All right, welcome back. By now, you're probably settled in, maybe a little more relaxed, maybe slightly more aware that building a pyramid is a lot of work. So let's slow things down even more. We've talked about the stones. We've walked through the chambers. We've met the workers, the planners, the quietly efficient scribes. Now, let's talk about why. Because the Great Pyramid wasn't built just to sit there looking impressive, although it does that very well. It was built for something very specific, an afterlife plan, a very detailed one. The ancient Egyptians had a structured view of what happens after death. Not vague, not we'll figure it out later. No, they had steps, rules, requirements, almost like preparing for a very long journey with strict entry conditions. And at the center of that belief system was the idea that life didn't end. It continued, just somewhere else. But getting there wasn't automatic. You didn't just wake up in the afterlife and think, oh, nice new place. There were processes, evaluations, possibly paperwork if the scribes had anything to say about it. One of the key concepts was the soul, actually multiple parts of it, because one soul wasn't complicated enough. There was the Ka, the life force, the Ba, something like personality or spirit, and the Ak, the transformed version that could exist in the afterlife. Each part had a role. Each part needed to stay intact, which meant the body also needed to stay intact. And that brings us to mummification. Now, we won't go into anything too detailed here, because this is a calm, sleepy story, not a medical documentary. But the basic idea is simple: preserve the body, carefully, deliberately, so that it can be recognized later. Because in the Egyptian view, the afterlife wasn't just abstract. It was connected to identity, to memory, to continuity. You were still you, just somewhere else. And for a pharaoh like Khufu, this process needed to be flawless. No shortcuts, no good enough. Because he wasn't just any person, he was divine, or at least very close to it. So the pyramid becomes more than a tomb. It becomes a machine, not in the modern sense, but in a symbolic sense, a structure designed to support a transition from life to afterlife, from Earth to something beyond. let's return to the king's chamber for a moment. That quiet granite room, simple, still, centered. That's where Khufu was meant to rest, not permanently, but as part of the process. And those shafts we mentioned earlier, the narrow channels leading outward, some believe they were aligned with specific stars, possibly connected to constellations associated with the afterlife, which suggests something quietly beautiful, a pathway, not physical, but symbolic, a direction. So while the pyramid looks solid and grounded, its purpose was upward, outward, beyond. Now, let's talk about something called the weighing of the heart, because this is where things get gently intense, but we'll keep it calm. In Egyptian belief, after death, a person's heart would be weighed against a feather. The feather represented truth, order, balance. If the heart was light, balanced, you passed. If it was heavy, weighed down by wrongdoing, well, let's just say the outcome was not ideal. But again, we're not focusing on anything dramatic, just the idea that life mattered, that actions had weight, that there was a kind of quiet accountability. And for someone like Khufu, the expectation was clear. He would pass. Of course he would. He was Pharaoh. The system was designed with that in mind, which brings us back to the pyramid. All of this belief, all of this structure required preparation. Objects were placed in tombs, food, tools, items for the afterlife, because the journey wasn't just spiritual, it was practical. You might need things. And yet, in the Great Pyramid, very little was found. No grand treasure, no elaborate collections, just the structure itself, which again feels intentional. It's almost as if the pyramid wasn't about what was inside, but about the act of building it, the scale, the effort, the permanence. Now, let's pause for a moment. Imagine being one of the workers, hearing about this belief system, knowing that the pharaoh you're building for is preparing for eternity, and your role is to help make that possible. Would you believe it? Would you question it? Or would you just focus on the next stone? Probably a mix of all three, because people tend to be complicated like that. And yet, the system held, the work continued, the structure rose. Now, here's a quiet irony. Despite all this planning, all this preparation, all this effort to ensure a smooth transition, we don't actually know what Khufu's afterlife experience was like. No updates, no reports, no everything went well message, just silence. And maybe that's okay, because the pyramid was never really about proving anything to us. It was about belief, about intention, about creating something that matched a worldview. And in that sense, it succeeded, because thousands of years later, we're still looking at it, still thinking about it, still wondering what it meant and how it worked. So, as the desert cools again and the stars begin to appear, we can let that idea settle. A structure built not just for the present, but for something beyond it. And in the next part, we'll gently explore how the pyramids changed over time, how later rulers tried to copy, improve, or quietly avoid certain mistakes. Because once you build something this big, everyone else has to respond, and not all of them got it right. All right, welcome back again. At this point, the desert is probably starting to feel familiar. The slow wind, the quiet horizon, the very large triangle that refuses to explain itself. So let's keep drifting. We've looked at how the Great Pyramid may have been built. We've wandered through its chambers. We've talked about the people and their very organized afterlife plans. Now, let's look at what happened next. Because once Khufu finished building something that massive, other rulers had a choice. They could admire it, they could try to copy it, or they could try to outdo it. And as it turns out, they mostly chose option 2. Let's begin with Khafre, Khufu's son. Because, of course, the next pharaoh looked at the Great Pyramid and thought, yes, but what if I made mine slightly better? Not dramatically better, just improved. Maybe a bit more stylish, a bit more refined. You know, subtle competition. Khafre's pyramid is the second largest at Giza, and for a long time, people actually thought it was the biggest. Why? Because it sits on slightly higher ground, which gives it a visual advantage, a kind of ancient optical illusion. Very clever, or possibly just convenient geography. Khafre also kept some of the original outer casing stones near the top of his pyramid. Smooth, polished limestone that once covered the entire structure. So if you look closely, you can still see a hint of what the Great Pyramid might have looked like when it was new. Bright, reflective, almost glowing in the sunlight. Not the rough, stepped surface we see today, but something smoother, more finished, which honestly must have been quite a sight. And then there's the Sphinx. Now, technically, the Sphinx isn't a pyramid, but it's right there, watching everything, very calmly, very seriously, as if it's been observing human behavior for thousands of years and has decided not to comment. The Sphinx is usually associated with Khafre, a massive statue with the body of a lion and the head of a human, possibly representing the pharaoh himself. Because if you're building a pyramid, why not also carve a giant guardian figure out of rock, just to complete the look? Now, let's gently float over to the next ruler, Menkaure. Menkaure's pyramid is smaller, noticeably smaller, which might seem like a step backward, but it's also more refined in some ways, better materials in certain sections, more detailed construction, almost like he looked at the previous projects and thought, maybe we don't need to go bigger, maybe we go smarter, which is a very modern-sounding idea. So at Giza, we end up with 3 main pyramids, Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure, each one slightly different, each one part of a larger story, a kind of architectural conversation across generations. But here's where things start to shift. After Giza, pyramid building continues, but it changes, and not always in ways that worked out. Let's drift back a little earlier to someone who came before Khufu, a pharaoh named Djoser. Djoser's pyramid is located at Saqqara, and it's a bit different. Instead of smooth sides, it has steps, like a staircase reaching upward, which is why it's called the Step Pyramid. This was one of the earliest large-scale stone structures in Egypt, designed by a man named Imhotep, who over time became something of a legend, architect, engineer, possibly the kind of person who quietly solves problems while everyone else is still figuring out what the problem is. The Step Pyramid was a big deal. It showed that building in stone, at scale, was possible. But it also wasn't quite the final form, more like a prototype. Then came Sneferu. Sneferu is interesting because he didn't just build one pyramid, he built several, which sounds ambitious, and it was, but it also involved some trial and error. First, there's the Medum Pyramid, which partially collapsed. Not ideal.
Then there's the bent pyramid, which starts at one angle and then suddenly changes slope halfway up, as if the builders realized mid-project that something wasn't quite right. And instead of starting over, they adjusted. Because why not? Finally, there's the red pyramid, which is considered the first successful true pyramid. Smooth sides, stable structure, no sudden angle changes. A kind of quiet success after a few less successful attempts. So by the time Khufu came along, there was already experience. Lessons learned, mistakes made, and corrected. Which brings us back to the Great Pyramid. It didn't appear out of nowhere. It was the result of iteration. improvement over time, which, again, feels very human. Now, after the Giza pyramids, something interesting happens. Pyramids continue to be built, but they gradually become smaller, less precise, sometimes made with different materials, like mud brick instead of solid stone, which doesn't age quite as well. And over time, the focus shifts. Instead of building massive pyramids, later pharaohs begin to favor hidden tombs, carved into rock, buried in valleys, less visible, more protected. Because by then, tomb robbing had become a serious issue, and building a giant, highly visible structure that says "important person buried here" was maybe not the most secure strategy. So the approach changes, from visible to hidden, from monumental to discreet, which is a very different kind of thinking. But the pyramids remain, standing, quiet, unchanged. And that's part of what makes them so fascinating. They represent a moment, a specific period in time when building something enormous, in plain sight, felt like the right choice. And even though that approach didn't last forever, the structures did. Now, as we let the desert stretch out again and the pyramids settle back into stillness, we can start to notice something.
The mystery isn't just in how they were built. It's also in why that style, that scale, that approach happened when it did, and then slowly faded. So in the next part, we'll drift into the modern world. Explorers, archaeologists, early theories, and the long process of trying to understand something that was never meant to explain itself. Because, of course, we couldn't just leave it alone. All right, welcome back. By now, the pyramids have been standing quietly for thousands of years. The workers are long gone. The pharaohs have moved on to whatever came next in their very detailed afterlife plan. And into that silence, eventually, come the visitors. Not tourists with cameras just yet, not guided tours and souvenir shops. No, first come the curious ones. The explorers, the scholars, the people who looked at these massive stone structures and thought very calmly, okay, but how? Let's drift forward in time. Centuries pass. Empires rise and fall. Languages change. Knowledge fades and then slowly returns. And through it all, the pyramids remain. Slightly weathered, a bit less polished than before, but still there. Still quietly confusing. Now, for a long time, people didn't fully understand who built the pyramids or how. Ancient Greek historians, like Herodotus, visited Egypt and tried to make sense of what they saw. He wrote about large numbers of workers, long construction times, ramps. Some of his ideas were surprisingly close. Others were a bit imaginative, which is fair. He was working with limited information and probably a very hot climate. But even with early writings, the full picture wasn't clear. So the pyramids became something of a puzzle, a very large, very visible puzzle. Fast forward again to the 18th and 19th centuries. This is when things start to get more organized, more systematic. Because now we have archaeology, or at least early versions of it. People begin to study the pyramids more carefully, measuring, mapping, documenting, not just looking, but analyzing. One of the key moments comes with Napoleon's expedition to Egypt. Yes, that Napoleon. Because apparently conquering Europe wasn't enough. He also decided to bring scholars along to study ancient monuments, as one does. These scholars recorded everything they could, drawings, measurements, observations, and slowly a clearer picture began to form.
Not complete, not perfect, but clearer. Now, let's pause here for a moment, because early archaeology was not always gentle. In some cases, people explored pyramids by, well, breaking into them, creating new entrances, removing stones, digging through passages, because patience was not always a priority. And while that helped uncover some information, it also caused damage, which, in hindsight, was not ideal. But over time, methods improved. Archaeologists became more careful, more respectful, less likely to casually dismantle ancient structures in the name of curiosity, which is definitely progress. Now, let's talk about measurement. One of the things that fascinated early researchers was the precision of the Great Pyramid. The alignment, the angles, the proportions. Everything seemed deliberate. And this led to some interesting interpretations. Some people believed the pyramid encoded mathematical constants. Others thought it contained hidden knowledge about the Earth, or the stars, or time itself. There were theories about secret messages, ancient wisdom, even predictions. Because when something is precise and old and a little mysterious, people tend to look for deeper meaning. And sometimes they find it. Or at least they think they do. Now, to be fair, the pyramid does show impressive understanding of geometry. The base is square, the sides slope at consistent angles, the alignment with cardinal directions is very close. But does it contain hidden codes about the future? Probably not. Does it reflect careful planning and skilled execution? Yes, very much so. And sometimes that's enough. Now, let's gently move into modern times. Technology improves, tools become more advanced, and archaeologists gain new ways to study ancient structures without damaging them. We mentioned earlier something called muon scanning. This is a method that uses cosmic particles, yes, actual particles from space, to detect empty spaces inside solid structures. It sounds complicated, and it is. But the idea is simple. These particles pass through stone, and by measuring how they behave, scientists can identify areas where there's less material. In other words, empty spaces. And when this method was used on the Great Pyramid, it revealed something interesting. Large voids, previously unknown spaces, hidden within the structure. Now, before we get too excited, we should remember something. An empty space is not automatically a secret chamber. It could be structural. It could be part of the original design. It could be something we don't fully understand yet. Or it could just be empty, which is slightly less dramatic, but still important. Because each new discovery adds to the picture, even if it doesn't answer everything. Now, let's talk about one more thing. The human tendency to fill in the gaps. When we don't have all the answers, we create them. Stories, theories, explanations. Some grounded in evidence, others a bit more creative. Aliens, again, make an appearance here. Because of course they do. But as we've seen, there's no real need for that explanation. The tools were simple, but effective. The organization was complex, but human. The effort was enormous, but possible. And maybe that's the most interesting part. Not that the pyramids are impossible, but that they are possible. That a group of people, thousands of years ago, with limited technology, could plan, coordinate, and complete something so large, so precise, and so lasting.
Not perfectly, not effortlessly, but successfully. And that idea is quietly powerful. Now, as we let the modern world fade slightly and return our focus to the desert, we can see the pyramids again. Not just as mysteries, but as results of time, of effort, of human persistence. Still standing, still silent, still just a little bit difficult to fully explain. And in the next part,
we'll gently step back even further, looking at how the pyramids fit into the larger story of human history and why they continue to matter, even now. Because something this old and this steady tends to leave a lasting impression. All right, welcome back. We've come a long way, slowly, quietly, one stone at a time. We've stood outside the pyramids. We've wandered through their corridors. We've met the workers, the planners, the pharaoh with a very long-term vision. We've even followed the scholars, centuries later, trying to piece everything together without accidentally knocking anything over. And now, we arrive at a soft, not how they were built, not even why they were built, but why they still matter. Because here's the thing, the pyramids are old, very old, older than most things we interact with daily, older than modern countries, older than most written traditions, older than almost every building still standing. And yet, people still travel across the world to see them, still take photos, still stand in the desert, squinting slightly, trying to take it all in. So, what is it? What keeps them relevant? Part of it is scale. There's something about standing next to something that large that changes your perspective. You realize very quickly you are not the biggest thing in the room, or the desert, or the timeline. And that can be oddly calming. Because in a world that often feels fast and loud and constantly updating, the pyramids are steady. They don't refresh. They don't notify you. They don't change. They just exist. And that kind of stillness is rare. Another part is effort. When you look at the pyramids, you're not just seeing stone. You're seeing time, labor, planning, thousands of small actions repeated over years, coming together into one structure. And that idea carries forward. Because even now, large achievements are built the same way. Not all at once, but step by step, piece by piece. It's just usually with fewer sandstorms. Then there's the mystery. Not the dramatic kind, not the hidden secret that changes everything kind, but the quiet kind. The kind that says, we understand most of this, but not all of it. And that's enough to keep people curious, because complete certainty is less interesting than partial understanding. Now, let's zoom out even more. The pyramids are part of a larger human pattern. Across history, people have built things to last. Monuments, temples, structures that go beyond immediate needs. Not just for shelter or function, but for meaning. To say something, to leave something behind. And the pyramids are one of the earliest and most extreme examples of that. They weren't built because they were easy, or efficient, or necessary in a practical sense. They were built because someone believed they mattered. And that belief turned into action, which is quietly powerful. Now, let's bring it back to the present. Today, we have machines, cranes, computers, advanced tools. We can build faster, higher, more efficiently. And yet, we still look back at the pyramids and feel something.
Not confusion, exactly. Not disbelief, but respect. Because even with all our tools, we recognize the effort it must have taken. And maybe we also recognize something else. That humans, across time, are not that different. We still want to create things. We still want to leave something behind.
we still want our work to matter. The scale changes, the materials change, but the intention stays. Now, as the sun begins to set one last time over the desert, let's just sit with that for a moment. The pyramids don't speak. They don't explain themselves. They don't offer instructions or conclusions. They just remain. And maybe that's enough. Because not every story needs a clear ending. Some stories are just there to be experienced, to be observed, to be quietly thought about, and then gently set aside. So whether you came here out of curiosity or just needed something calm to listen to, the pyramids have done what they've always done. They've given you something to look at, something to think about, and then nothing more. And that's kind of perfect. Thanks for staying. Take it easy, and maybe next time we'll wander somewhere else just as quiet and just as quietly confusing.
All right, one last time. Welcome back. At this point, there's not much left to solve. The pyramids are still there. The questions are still there too. And somehow, neither one is in a hurry to leave. So let's just stay with it a little longer. No urgency, no dramatic turns. Just the slow realization that some things are meant to outlast explanations. Because here's something people don't always say out loud. The pyramids didn't just survive time. They outlasted certainty. Empires came and went. Languages changed. Maps were redrawn. Entire ways of understanding the world were replaced. And yet, the pyramids stayed exactly where they were placed. Quiet, solid, unmoved. Even now, when you look at them through modern eyes, there's a strange contrast. We live in a world of updates. Everything changes constantly. New information replaces old information almost immediately. And yet the pyramids are the opposite of that system. They don't update. They don't evolve. They just remain in their original form, as if time itself forgot to file a revision. And maybe that's part of why they feel so strange. Because they don't behave like most human creations. Most things we build are meant to be used, replaced, improved. But the pyramids feel like they were built for a different category entirely. Not for daily life, not for convenience, but for permanence. And permanence is uncomfortable because it forces perspective. Even when they don't fully understand what that meaning will become, the pyramids may have been about pharaohs, afterlife beliefs, political power, engineering skill. All of that is true. But they also became something else, something larger than their original purpose. They became a question that keeps getting asked, and answers keep shifting, because every generation looks at them differently. Ancient Egyptians saw divine preparation. Greek historians saw wonders of the world. Modern engineers see precision and logistics. Modern travelers see history made visible. Same structures, different interpretations. And none of them fully cancel the others out. They just layer on top of each other, like sediment, like time itself. So maybe the pyramids aren't a puzzle with one solution. Maybe they're more like a mirror, reflecting whatever we bring to them. Curiosity, wonder, confusion, respect, sometimes all at once. And now, as we reach the end of this long, slow walk through sand and stone, there's nothing dramatic left to reveal.
No final secret, no sudden answer. Just the pyramids. Still there. Still unchanged. Still doing what they've always done. Existing. And maybe that's the real conclusion. Not that we solved them, but that we learned how to sit with something we don't fully solve. So take that with you, wherever you go next. A structure that refuses to explain itself, and somehow doesn't need to. Good night, or good day, depending on where you are. And whenever you look up ancient history again, just remember, some things aren't meant to be finished. They're meant to be remembered.
All right. Still here. That's kind of the mood now, isn't it? The pyramids aren't going anywhere. The questions aren't either. And at this point, even the desert seems like it has settled into the idea that we're not leaving with neat answers. So, one final slow walk. Not to find something new, just to notice what's already there. Because after all the theories, the timelines, the workers, the pharaohs, the scholars, the ramps, the chambers, and the silence, what we're really left with is something surprisingly simple. A place built by people that survived. Let's go back outside the Great Pyramid for a moment. Imagine standing at its base again, looking up, not rushing, not analyzing, just looking. The first thing that happens is perspective shifts. The pyramid doesn't feel like a structure anymore. It feels like a presence. Something that doesn't need attention, but naturally gets it anyway. And there's something slightly humbling about that. Because nothing about it tries to impress you. It just does. No flashing lights. No announcements. No explanation panels carved into the stone saying, "Please be impressed now." Just geometry. And time. Now, let's imagine the desert at different moments. Morning. Cool air. Long shadows. Everything quiet and soft. Midday. Heat rising. Light bouncing off stone. The pyramid almost blending into the sky in brightness. Evening. Golden tones. Everything slows down again. Even thoughts feel like they're moving through sand. And through all of it, the pyramid stays the same. The environment changes around it. But it doesn't react. That kind of stability is rare in anything human-made. Most things age visibly, shift, break down, get replaced. But here, the aging is different. It's not disappearance, it's transformation. From smooth casing to exposed core, from bright surface to textured history. It doesn't fall apart, it reveals itself. And maybe that's why people keep returning to it. Not because it changes, but because it doesn't. Now, let's think about sound. Or rather, the lack of it. If you stand near the pyramids long enough, you start to notice something unusual. The absence of noise that usually defines human spaces. No engines, no machines, no layered background sound of modern life. Just wind. Maybe footsteps. Maybe your own breathing, a little louder than expected. And in that quiet, your thoughts get louder. Not in a stressful way, just more noticeable. Which is probably why people describe the experience as feeling something rather than learning something. Because it's not just information, it's atmosphere.
Now, let's gently return to the people one more time, because they're still the center of all of this, even if the stone is what remains. There's something almost ordinary about the way it began. People waking up, going to work, doing tasks assigned to them, not knowing they were building something that would outlast almost everything else in their world. No one on site was thinking, this will become one of the most famous structures in human history. They were thinking, move that block, check that measurement, bring more water, keep going.
Because the pyramids aren't finished speaking. They just speak very quietly and very slowly. All right, you're still here. That's kind of fitting. Because at this point, there's nothing left that demands attention. No big twist waiting around the corner. No dramatic discovery hiding behind the next sentence. Just the afterfeel. The quiet part of the story, where everything that's been said slowly settles into place. Let's not rush it. The pyramids never did. There's a strange thing that happens after spending time with something like this. At first, you want answers. Exact ones. Clean ones. Something you can file away and say, that's solved. But the longer you sit with it, the more that need starts to soften. Not disappear, just loosen. Because the pyramids don't really behave like a problem to be solved. They behave more like a fact of the world, like mountains or rivers or stars. You can study them, measure them, explain parts of them, but they don't fully turn into something you can finish. And maybe that's why they've survived so many generations of interpretation. Every era comes with its own confidence, its own theories, its own version of certainty. And the pyramids just quietly wait for the next one. Now let's imagine something small, not historical, not grand, just human. A worker at the pyramid site, sitting down at the end of a long day, hands dusty, body tired, watching the light change over the desert. Not thinking about legacy, not thinking about history, just thinking about rest. That moment doesn't get carved into stone. It doesn't appear in textbooks, but it mattered because it's part of the same reality that built everything we're talking about. And that's the thing about history like this. It's not just made of kings and monuments. It's made of pauses, breaks, routine days that didn't feel important at all while they were happening. Now let's step back again. If you zoom out far enough, the pyramids become part of something even bigger. Not just ancient Egypt, not just architecture, but human behavior itself. The urge to organize, to build, to plan beyond a single lifetime. To create something that says, I was here, even if no one remembers the name attached to the hands that actually placed the stones. And that's a quiet kind of contradiction. The structure is permanent. The individuals are not. But both are necessary. Without the people, nothing rises. Without the structure, the effort disappears into time. Together, they create something that outlives both. Now, let's talk about uncertainty for a moment, because we've used that word a lot in this journey. Uncertainty isn't really the enemy here. It's part of the experience. It's what keeps the pyramids from becoming simple. It's what keeps them from turning into just another solved equation in history. If everything about them were fully known, they would feel smaller, less interesting, less human in a way. But because some parts remain open,
they stay active in the imagination. Not as myths, not as puzzles waiting for a single answer, but as something ongoing. Now, one last slow image: the pyramids at night. No crowds, no noise, just moonlight falling across stone that has already seen more nights than we can easily count. And in that moment, they don't feel like monuments. They feel like witnesses to time, to change, to everything that has come and gone around them. And they are not reacting to any of it. They are just there. Which brings us, gently, to the simplest conclusion this story has been offering all along. Not that the pyramids are impossible, not that they are mysterious beyond understanding, but that they are the result of something very understandable. People working over time, with intention. And somehow, that combination was enough to create something that still stands today. So there's no final secret waiting here, no hidden ending, just the same desert, the same structure, the same quiet refusal to turn itself into something smaller than it is. And maybe that's the real takeaway. Not answers, but scale. Not mystery, but continuity. The pyramids don't need to be solved. They just need to be seen. And once you've seen them like this, slowly, over time, without rushing toward closure, they stop feeling like a question and start feeling like a presence. Still here, still standing, still not in a hurry to explain itself. And neither, really, are we. So we'll leave it here. No final reveal, no dramatic ending. Just the quiet fact that some things in history are not meant to conclude. They are meant to remain. All right, still here. At this point, it's fair to say the pyramids have done what they always do best. They haven't changed at all, but they've changed how we look at them. And that's kind of the final trick. Not a reveal, not a secret, just perspective. Because when a story goes on long enough, something interesting happens. The ending starts to feel less like a conclusion and more like a pause. A moment where things stop moving forward on the surface, but continue quietly underneath. So let's not force closure here. The pyramids never did. Instead, let's just sit with the simplest version of everything we've talked about. No theories layered on top of theories, no urgency to explain every corner of it. Just the basic outline. A group of people, a desert, a long stretch of time, and a decision to build something that would last far beyond the lives of those who built it. That's it. That's the core. Everything else, the ramps, the chambers, the alignments, the afterlife beliefs, the scholars, the debates, the modern scans, the unanswered questions, that all sits on top of that foundation. But the foundation itself is almost ordinary. Human effort, repeated consistently. And maybe that's why the pyramids feel slightly unsettling in a quiet way. Because they remove the illusion that complexity always requires mystery. Sometimes it just requires time. Now, imagine this: a single stone being placed. Not dramatic, not symbolic, just one stone. Then another, then another. No one watching in that moment would think, this is history being made. They would think, this is work. And yet, that work accumulates into something that eventually becomes history. Not instantly, not noticeably, but gradually. which is a reminder that most things that feel big in hindsight don't feel big while they're happening. They feel repetitive, even ordinary. Now, let's drift one last time into the desert. Not to look for answers, just to observe. The pyramids don't demand interpretation. They don't interrupt your thoughts. They don't argue with you. They just sit there, occupying space across centuries. And in doing so, they quietly change what time feels like. Because suddenly, 1,000 years doesn't feel abstract anymore. It feels like something that has already passed through a single location, without moving it. That's a strange thing to realize, that something can be so still and still outlast everything around it. So maybe the final takeaway isn't a fact, or a theory, or a historical explanation. Maybe it's just this. Some things are built not to be understood all at once, but to be returned to, again and again, from different angles, at different times, with different questions. And every time, they remain unchanged. But you don't. So as we finally step away from this long walk through stone and silence, there's nothing new waiting. No hidden message, no final answer tucked inside the walls. Just the same horizon we started with, and the same structures that have been there the whole time. Still standing, still quiet, still not finished with being looked at. All right, here we are again. At some point, even time starts to feel like it's sitting down next to you, not rushing you forward anymore. And the pyramids? They're still doing what they've always done. Absolutely nothing in a hurry. So let's not break that rhythm now. Because endings, in stories like this, are a bit of an illusion. We call something the end when we run out of pages, or time, or energy. But the thing itself doesn't end. It just continues existing somewhere, outside the frame we're looking through. The pyramids are good at that. They exist outside frames, outside expectations, outside the idea that everything must eventually become clear and neatly summarized. Now, imagine standing at a distance again, far enough that the details blur, close enough that the shape still matters. Just 3 forms on the horizon, still recognizable, still there, still doing nothing except being exactly what they are. And something about that simplicity feels almost final. Not dramatic final, not story-ending final. More like a sentence that has finished saying what it needed to say and doesn't need punctuation anymore. So instead of trying to close the story, let's just notice what's left after all the talking. There's still stone. There's still sand. There's still wind moving across surfaces that were already old when most of recorded history began. And there's still us, looking at it, trying to make sense of it. Which is, in a way, the real pattern here. Not the building, not even the builders, but the looking. Because every generation looks at the pyramids and asks the same thing in slightly different words. How did they do this? And underneath that, why did they do this? And even deeper than that, what does it mean that they did? And the pyramids never answer directly. They just stay there, long enough for the questions to change shape. Now, let's slow everything down a little more. If you remove all interpretation, all theories, all speculation. What remains is still impressive. Not mysterious, just large, precise, old. And maybe that's enough. Because sometimes the mind wants stories where everything resolves into meaning. But reality doesn't always work that way. Some things are built. Some things endure. Some things simply outlast the need for explanation. And that doesn't make them empty. It makes them stable. Now imagine this last small moment. No crowds.
No narration. No history books open nearby. Just wind passing over stone. That's it. Nothing happening. And yet, everything's still present. That's the strange balance the pyramids hold. They are full of meaning when you look for it, and completely indifferent when you don't. Both at the same time. So maybe the only honest way to leave this story is not with a conclusion, but with a pause that feels like it could continue forever if you let it. Because the pyramids don't actually finish. They just remain. And whatever story we tell about them eventually steps aside and lets them be what they already are. So we'll leave them here. Not solved, not explained away, not reduced into something smaller than they are. Just standing in the same place, under the same sky, doing exactly what they've always done. And the rest, we can simply carry with us, quietly, without needing to wrap it up.